I want to entitle this video "An Overlooked Passage in the Limited Atonement Debate." 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through or 3 and following. And I remember dealing with a lot of Calvinists over the years on Pal Talk. And this is a passage I would bring up because it's an overlooked passage in the whole limited atonement discussion, the scope of the atonement. And so this is going to be a brief video. I'm working on an article right now and a video on limited atonement, a more broader scope, the history of it, and passages such as Romans 5:12 through 19, this passage before us, 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following, 2 Corinthians 15:14 through 21, and 1 Timothy 4:10. We'll be dealing with those passages in another video on limited atonement, but this is going to be very brief. It's an overlooked passage, but I think it's a pretty pivotal passage. Verse 3 and following, but I'm going to start with verse 1. 1 Corinthians 15:1. Now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you. Now he's dealing with the Corinthians, and he's making a logical argument. Well, if you deny the resurrection, then you deny the resurrection of Christ. And so he preached this to them when they were unbelievers. You don't preach the gospel necessarily to believers, but to unbelievers. So when he first came to them, I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you, which also you received. So before that, they didn't receive the gospel. This is the gospel Paul preached to them. The gospel they received, in which also you stand, by which also you were saved, if you hold fast to the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance, which I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, after that appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, so on and so forth. And so this is an early creedal statement that begins in verse 3, and scholars aren't sure where it would end. Verse 9, verse 7, verse 10. Anyway, it's an early creedal statement that goes back to 2 years after the death of Christ. Verse 3 probably through 5. And we see these early creedal statements in other passages in the New Testament as well. Quite a few of them. Philippians 2, 5 through 11, so on and so forth. So this is a creedal statement. Now let's back up again. Now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preached to you. Paul preached this gospel to the Corinthians, which also you received. So they received this gospel. They received it. They didn't believe before this. And yet what did Paul preach to them again? By which also you are saved if you hold fast to the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. Paul preached, and they received, these unbelievers at Corinth, they believed and received that Christ died for them according to the Scriptures. This is the gospel that Paul preached to the unbelievers at Corinth, which they received. Did Paul say Christ died for some of you? No, he died for our sins. Everyone in the discussion, our sins, according to the Scriptures. He was buried and he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. So this is an overlooked passage because it demonstrates, I believe, very nicely that the church at Corinth, Paul shows clearly what he preached to them, what they received. That Jesus' first importance, that he died for our sins, according to the Scriptures. This is the gospel Paul preached. 1 Corinthians 2 as well is very important. Start in verse 29 of chapter 1. 1 Corinthians 1:29 through 2 through 2. Paul preached nothing but Christ crucified. But this is an overlooked passage. Just think of it. They first believed it and they first received it. What was it? That Christ died for our sins. Simple as that. That's part of the gospel that Paul preached. No limited atonement. No limited atonement. So that's just in a nutshell, an overlooked passage. 1 Corinthians 15, 3 and following. Very interesting passage. And I brought this up to Matt Slick from Carm. I had a little discussion with him on this passage and on Romans 5, 12 and following. And I completely destroyed him in that discussion. Because they can't handle these type of passages. It's pretty difficult for them. So that's about it, guys. Hopefully, in the next few days, I can get another video up on limited atonement and the scope of the atonement. Who did Christ really die for? Okay, thanks a lot.